Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Curtis Fox, who is a former Green Beret, and he served as a demolitions and combat engineering expert in a Special Forces operational detachment, as well as other operational duties and missions. He separated from the Army in 2016 to attend the NBA program at Georgetown before re-entering public service in the Department of Defense. Curtis Fox, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited for our discussion.
Likewise. And before we begin, I just would like to let our audience know that Curtis's opinions are his own and don't reflect the opinions of any U.S. government or any other government agency for that matter. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Curtis, will cover your new book, Hybrid Warfare: The Russian Approach to Strategic Competition and Conventional Military Conflict. And we'll be sure to have a link in the show notes so that people can go and check this out for themselves. But before we get into this, could we please start by getting your overall assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you like, the times in which we live?
The times in which we live, or our strategic landscape.
Well, yeah, some people choose to answer this question differently. It's not intended to be like a PhD dissertation defense, but just what's your hot take? What are the things that you think are the most important for people to be aware of when it comes to today's world?
In general, I think the West is having a slight crisis of identity, and that's affecting foreign policy. It's definitely created a window for Russia to act in its near abroad. I think Peter Zion is a geopolitical analyst who I think does a very good job of laying out, the trends that are happening in the West right now. But one of the big ones is population decline or demographic decline. This is perhaps the most advanced in Japan, and then maybe South Korea, and then Germany and Italy and Russia follow close behind them. China is kind of a horrifying case of population decline due to the one-child policy. We have, I might call it, let's say, populist turmoil in the United States, United Kingdom, all across Europe. The only Western powers that don't seem to be having, such a crisis are Japan and Korea. And that would be an interesting discussion as to why they're not, having those internal problems. Russia is acting in the political uncertainty of the present. The Russian strategic position it should be very, very familiar to pretty much anybody who's been in the driver's seat in the Kremlin. The Russians are on the vast northern Eurasian steppe. They don't have any real boundaries except for vast open expanses of space. And so what they've always done is to expand and in order to achieve a degree of security. And when they run into new populations, they absorb those populations into their numbers and their ranks. And this is something that's been playing out, ever since the Rus ethnicity emerged back in the 8th century. The apogee of this grand strategy was achieved under Joseph Stalin in 1945. He let's say, conquered most of Eastern Europe, and then most of those states were subsumed into the Soviet Union directly, and those that weren't subsumed into the Soviet Union were made client states through the Warsaw Pact, which became a counterbalance to the NATO alliance. In most of those states, he imposed, a Soviet-style socialist government. The Soviet Union, using that strategy, was able to forward station heavy ground forces in East Germany on the western side of the Fulda Gap. And that is their definition of security. That is when they feel, particularly safe. This was a grand strategy that Catherine the Great or Peter the Great before her would have been able to articulate very well, and because they're looking at effectively the same dashboard. In 1991, that grand strategy, quarterbacked by the Soviet Union, collapsed,
Mhm.
and there was a profound decline in the Russian security environment, and that is what Boris Yeltsin inherited, and that's what Vladimir Putin has fallen into. And Putin is there are unique things about his regime, but his geopolitical objectives have not changed, and he'll continue to pursue that same grand strategy. It's the same strategy the Russians had in the 1500s. It's the same grand strategy that they have
Mm, mm. So you're making the case that uh, the you know, Russia's perspective and the way they are situated geographically, uh, you know, going back many centuries, obviously, that directly informs their brand of warfare that we are observing today, hybrid warfare.
Yes, let's say it's the well, you could call it the strategic underpinnings of a strategy. They need, let's say a military method of shaping their strategic environment. And hybrid warfare is that methodology.
Right. So, we are recording this on February 21st, 2024. And very recently in the news was Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin, which was just like a week ago as we're recording this. And one of the things that Vladimir Putin did was he went on a very long, recap from his perspective of, the Russian perspective and history. I think going all the way back to the 8th century. Well, first of all, did you catch this interview? And uh, do you have any observations that relates to this conversation based on that interview?
Yeah, well, first off, I watched it, so you don't have to. So if you haven't watched all 2 hours of it, don't feel like you have to labor through it.
Yeah.
Um, it was,
Do you speak Russian, by the way?
I do. Speak is a strong word. I
Okay.
used to be able to have a strong argument, with you about, the finer points of the Russian education system versus the German education system. Like I used to be able to really argue about things that matter.
Mm,
But unfortunately, if you don't use it, it just declines. If you
okay.
approach a Russian in the United States and you just start speaking Russian to them, they kind of shy away from you because they feel like they're being targeted. Um,
Okay. All right.
so yeah, it's not unfortunately something I've been able to maintain. I can still read a newspaper, but even that's getting a little rusty. To answer your question, there are a couple of key points I take away from Carlson's interview. Uh, but the first thing to point out is there are no new real revelations. Vladimir Putin, in his discussion with Carlson, kind of repeats the same propaganda talking points that Russia has always insisted on, whether that's in diplomatic circles or whether that's in their own, state-controlled media, like Russia Today or many of the other propaganda platforms that they have. The backbone of it is that the standoff in Ukraine was created by the West. The West has recklessly expanded into, the traditional sphere of influence of Russia, and Russia has simply insisted on the democratic process in Ukraine. And leaders like Viktor Yanukovych, who were legitimately elected, their only reason there was ever political opposition to those leaders was because the CIA backed popular resistance against him, or maybe even tried to back a coup against him. And this is a refrain that they started, even in 2004, during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, where that was the first, let's say, real populist groundswell against the pro-Russian regime. Viktor Yanukovych was a new candidate, but he lost in that election, and the Russians brought him back for another election. And this time he won in 2010. And Vladimir Putin kind of goes through his revised version of that history.
Yeah, I was
Um,
wanting to ask you about that, whether or not, based upon your historical understanding of uh, Russian history, how much of it, or what key points uh, are could be filed under, maybe not quite right from Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, that's the right way to say it. Is not quite right. He first off, he radically overestimates, the capabilities of the CIA. The CIA can't force a country of that many million people to rise up against a government by snapping its fingers. That's a nonsense talking point. The second issue is that he fundamentally misunderstands American perceptions of Russia. I think the regime in Washington, whichever party controls it, sees foreign policy issues with Russia as kind of uh, you know, a, a fourth tier or a fifth tier priority. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, um, I would argue that each consecutive president, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been more and more focused on internal issues in the United States. President Bill Clinton, by his own declaration, saw himself as a domestic president. George W. Bush, was following, Clinton's tenure. And he ran as a domestic president. He did get bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq, but he ran as a domestic president, and he championed domestic issues on the campaign trail. And in fact, if you remember back to 1999, the frustration with the American electorate at the time was that there was no real difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore when they were running. They were so similar, and they were both so centrist. Um, you can go on to Barack Obama. He fell into national leadership during the subprime mortgage crisis and the subsequent economic recession. And his foreign policy was guided, by don't do stupid stuff. And then Donald Trump was America first. With all of those domestic priorities in the United States, there's been no one in Washington to really, saber rattle against Russia or carry the torch against Moscow. Russia does things that pop up on our radar, on the American radar from time to time, and force us to pay attention to that part of the world. This would be the first and second Chechen wars. This would be the Russian intervention in Georgia. This would be the war in Donbass. This would be the Syrian intervention. And Vladimir Putin doesn't really seem to understand that. In his mind, Russia is a great power, and it's a geostrategic counterbalance to the American-led Western global order.
Right. Well, we're 10 minutes in here, Curtis, and we really haven't gotten to the crux of the matter, hybrid warfare. But I wanted to circle back with you on just one thing that you said earlier. You invoked Peter Zeihan, and coincidentally, I'm really interested to listen to another podcast discussion with Peter Zeihan. It just came out. It's with Sam Harris. I don't know if you ever follow Sam Harris and some of his discussions. I frequently find them to be pretty interesting. But Peter Zeihan, I guess I'm just wanting to get your opinion on this. I mean, the guy, I describe him as kind of like a human chat GPT, in that you can ask him any question and he will give you a 2,000 word stream of consciousness response with all kinds of facts and details that are so like logically assembled that it, it's mind blowing. Either he is has all of that stuff like at his fingertips, or his he can reach into his memory and pull out all these facts, or he's full of crap, or a combination. And I don't know. I guess I just wanted to ask you for your hot take on Peter Zeihan and his worldview.
Sure. And I'll be honest with you, I'm a big fan of Peter Zeihan. I
Yeah.
tune into
Okay.
him whenever I possibly can.
Okay. Good.
The other, I tune into George Friedman a lot, geopolitical futures. George Friedman was, I think, one of the founding minds in Stratfor.
Oh, okay.
And actually, Peter Zeihan started out working for George Friedman.
How's that right?
And there are a few other places I skim for information, especially in economics. I
No.
would,
Yeah.
if I were to ever have the privilege to interview Peter Zeihan, the big hole, and I think he would concede this in his methodology, is culture.
Mm-hmm.
He follows a methodology that was really established by Jared Diamond in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Jared Diamond does let's say a fundamentals analysis of how ancient civilizations were able to get started based on their geographic origins. And one of the things
Right.
he comes up with is,
And Russia really falls right into this kind of an analysis by Jared Diamond, because it wasn't one of the things that he part of his analysis looks at. uh, you could call it countries, but it doesn't have to be countries. But it's that not latitudinal directionality of having like similar crops and similar things can grow uh, around the latitudes, and having like broad latitude access is a like a necessary but insufficient way of generating like wealth. Am I recalling some of that right?
uh, yeah, I might get more specific, and I might say that a place like Mesopotamia has maybe a high concentration of all the different grasses that we can
Mhm.
actually domesticate in terms of formulating agriculture, and then it has the water resources between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, which enable agriculture in a real way, and that really is the foundation for the first urban centers. And so he takes that methodology and he looks at the other, great urban, let's say the great ancient urbanization projects in Egypt and in the Indus River Valley and in China, and he provides supporting material for his thesis. Where the thesis comes off the rails, I think, is in its failure to explain how Egypt, under its own rule, has become a moribund kind of backwater. And then Alexander the Great invades, and with the infusion of Greek culture and Greek critique, and the establishment of thought centers like Alexandria and the Great Library in Alexandria. Suddenly, under the Ptolemaic dynasty, which effectively is a Greek dynasty ruling over ancient Egypt, it becomes the breadbasket of the Mediterranean basin. And it suddenly surges forward and becomes let's say, a net agricultural exporting powerhouse. And it's the breadbasket that feeds both Greece and the Roman Empire after it.
Mhm.
And I don't think Jared Diamond's thesis explains that very well. And I think the importation of Greek culture and Greek management is absolutely the core pillar in that. And that's where Jared Diamond struggles. And that's something to bear in mind when you use Peter Zeihan's methodology in your analysis. And
Okay.
I'd love to talk to him about that.
Yeah.
But as I say, I listen to something from Peter Zeihan on a daily to weekly basis here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
All
big
right.
time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. Well, that was an impromptu question. All right. Well, let's get back into hybrid warfare. So, um, uh, how do you define hybrid warfare, and what sets it apart from other forms of warfare?
Sure. Hybrid warfare, I think, is best understood as a basket of tools. Let's say a whole of government basket of tools that enable you to wage a war below the actual threshold of a declared overt war. So you call it a political conflict, or let's say political competition. You want to leverage a whole government approach to maximize your efficiency. And you want to leverage a lot of tools like information warfare and low intensity conflict to rapidly seize the initiative, seize a number of limited objectives. And then once those objectives have been seized, particularly by elite special operations forces, you want to surge in heavy ground forces to entrench those gains immediately before the adversarial government can muster sufficient firepower to dislodge you.
I see. Well, this audience for the Cognitive Crucible tends to be heavily weighted towards information operations professionals, and so how would you make hybrid warfare matter for the IO community?
I would say, especially in the Russian employment, information related capabilities are the backbone. Targeted messaging and propaganda really are the backbone of hybrid warfare. When I say whole of government, of course, I mean that there's a diplomatic component, there's an economic and financial component. All of these are coercive measures, and they've all been informed of what it is that they're going to say and how it is that they're going to act, so that they can all make sure that all the institutions are moving in the same direction. But hybrid warfare really needs a cohesive narrative to support the campaign. And that gets really interesting when you look at, let's say, a successful hybrid war like the seizure of Crimea. Maybe if hybrid warfare had a Woodstock, that would be the Crimean annexation.
Okay.
And then
Okay. Yeah.
and a failed hybrid war would be the war in Donbass. And in the war in Donbass that follows immediately after the Crimean annexation, the propaganda that they used during the Crimean annexation is very much, in keeping with, trying to shore up the Viktor Yanukovych government. The West should not interfere with what are clearly regional affairs. Russia is an aid to Ukraine. And then they start, it switches almost immediately when they decide that they're going to conduct an intervention and seize Crimea. They start trumpeting more and more that Crimea should be, separate and independent and capable of being autonomous from Ukraine. And then when Russia actually conducts the seizure, they actually send what they call the KSSO. That's their national mission unit for the Russian ground forces to seize the Crimean parliamentary building. They kind of hold a staged plebiscite, let's say, and have them all vote to basically join Russia. And that narrative, needed to kind of establish the foundation for that. When you look at the war in Donbass, they try to take some of that narrative from Crimea and continue to move forward. So you have a number of Spetsnaz detachments that start penetrating, eastern Ukraine and the Donbas region. Donetsk and Luhansk are the center, but Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and other major cities are included in that. Kharkiv.
These are the special operations forces.
Yes,
Okay.
think of them as deep reconnaissance units.
Okay.
They're akin to LURS or maybe Marine Recon.
Okay.
But they often get complemented with an intelligence agent that's familiar with tradecraft, let's say. And they stand up, a bunch of people's mayors and people's governors in all of these little cities and try to basically create a grassroots a grassroots groundswell for autonomy for all of the ethnic Russian populations in Donbass. Well, you need a cohesive narrative to support a lot of that. So they use the Crimean narrative insisting on autonomy. And then they also start insisting on using, let's say, Ruski Mir, Russian world or the Russian diaspora. Let's say, or ethnic Slavic identity, pan-Slavic identity. And they use some of these narratives to try to create that groundswell. The problem is in, let's say over the summer of 2014 in Donbass, is that all of the Ukrainian people have heard these words before while the Russians were seizing Crimea. And so the narrative is tired. No one's buying it. No one believes what they're being told. No one believes what they're hearing. And the Ukrainian army does get itself together and pushes back. And it actually rolls back a Russian-sponsored insurgency in Donbass, and they're knocking on the door of Donetsk and Luhansk by the end of summer, about August of 2014. And the Russians have to surge in heavy ground forces in order to prop up this dying insurgency and then push the Ukrainians back to a strategically tenable position for the region. And they insist from a narrative standpoint that they're not involved in any way, and of course we all know that was nonsense. They were absolutely involved. It was most of the heavy fighting was Russian ground forces. But this is kind of the final point on hybrid warfare, is that when hybrid warfare falls apart, when the narrative is unbelievable, when there are too many objectives to be, let's say, discrete objectives to be seized by the available soft forces that you have in play, and when you are too slow to move heavy ground forces to reinforce those lightly entrenched gains, it falls apart. And when it falls apart, it ends up looking much more like a conventional slogging match. And when you look at the late engagements and the winter of 2014, December, and then on into January, February, March of 2015, they look a lot more like a World War I style slogging match with batteries of artillery, exchanging on one another while there's a slow movement forward of the line of engagement. And I might point out that in the current war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, that's exactly what's happened.
I see. Yeah. So the way you're describing it, to me paraphrasing at a very high level, is that Russia's method is pretty intricate, but you said that it is heavily reliant on narrative, and if the narrative falters, then I mean that's almost like a linchpin or a keystone, and if that falters, then it kind of quickly unravels and becomes a real mess where Russia doesn't achieve its objectives as quickly as it wanted, and it turns into something more of a kinetic slog, which becomes really problematic. They lose that surprise element and the quick element of it. Is that paraphrasing somewhat accurate?
I think that's a fairly good paraphrasing. I could give you 3 buzzwords to take with you. The first is Maskirovka. Maskirovka literally means camouflage, and it speaks to the hidden hand nature of what the Russians are trying to execute. They would prefer that their actions not be directly attributable to Russia or the Kremlin until it's already been done. The second is aktivnost. Aktivnost is activity, is what it literally means, and it's all of the little preparation of the environment activities that have to happen in order to enable kinetic military operations. So that would be intelligence operatives stirring up the local populace to go out and riot. That would be broadcasted propaganda and targeted messaging. That would be sending evidence of an affair, to a local military garrison commander, and letting him know that his wife is going to get those pictures unless he keeps his garrison on lockdown. That would be, threatening politicians and maybe targeting politicians, assassinations. That's how the Russians, prep the environment. And then Vinyezepnost is surprise, and that's the actual introduction of let's say first soft and then heavy ground forces to follow. So in the Russian lexicon, Vinyezepnost is, means surprise. But that means we're going to rapidly push in, let's say, Spetsnaz brigades and maybe special detachments of the VDV, which is the Russian Airborne Infantry, and then we'll follow them with a number of elite regiments of X, Y, and Z ground forces units in order to secure those gains.
Yeah, cool. Well, to your last point there, something I did want to ask you about. I'll ask it in a general way for you to answer more broadly, but specifically as well. I wanted to ask you what are some of Russia's like going forward challenges with employing hybrid warfare? I mean, not only are Western countries talking about it now, like we're onto this. We see patterns, and presumably we are thinking of ways to counter it. But also, you were just talking about how reliant they are upon special operations forces in order to make it work, which is expensive and takes time. And these forces don't just appear out of nowhere. So what are some of the like talent challenges that they must be experiencing, especially with this protracted conflict now in Ukraine, which is undoubtedly sucking up a lot of talent from the Russia's talent pool. So could you take that in whatever direction you think is productive?
Sure. And actually, the breakdown of what was supposed to be a hybrid war into the current Russo-Ukrainian war is actually it's a feature of the epilogue of my book. And I can go into very deep detail about that. But for sake of time, let me see. Yes, hybrid warfare does present the Russians a talent management issue. They absolutely, to be conducted well, they have to have officers that know how to take the initiative, in the ground forces especially. But they have to have, significant special operations forces, to seize the objectives. And those units have to be able to maneuver fast enough to get there, and they have to be able to run, the necessary logistics and supply to support them. When you look at how Russia actually manages its troops, they have tried to rely for the last number of years on contract soldiers that sign 3-year contracts, but traditionally they've always had conscripts that have to sign up for a 2-year term. Those conscripted soldiers, usually, it's 1 year where you're a new recruit, and you're learning everything, and the second year guys kind of abuse you and make you do their laundry and all sorts of stuff. And then in your second year, you're a senior guy and you get to do the abusing but when the Russians, this was under Defense Minister Anatoly Serdyukov, implemented a contract soldier scheme, they tried to professionalize the force. They weren't completely successful. They still have contract soldiers to do a lot of their admin positions, truck driving, things like that. But the contract soldiers they see as more motivated and more willing to participate, that they sign 3-year contracts. And those 3-year contracts, they have to stay around a little bit longer because the state's investing more in them, but they also get paid more. And there's opportunities for promotion and advancement. The VDV are going to get the pick of the litter first. That's the premier fighting force of the Russian armed forces. And then the Spetsnaz brigades will get those that are, let's say, most physically fit, mentally capable. and then the ground forces will get the rest. And that's really the way it works.
Hmm.
Um,
Do you have any insights on where Russia recruits from, whether they recruit from Russia proper or its satellite countries or from indigenous people in Africa, South America, etc.? All,
sure.
all, all, all all of the above?
All of the above is where they recruit from. You should actually watch some of their recruitment videos. They're real cute, and that they'll kind of they rely very much on nationalism and a sense of home to try to incentivize young men to enlist. I will say the Russian barracks are almost prison-like conditions. I mean, they're real bad, and the hazing is absolutely brutal and
Mm,
absolutely ruthless.
mhm,
Um, and there are a lot of families that just don't want their sons serving in those conditions. These days, with an active war, their recruiting numbers, I think, are down significantly, and they're relying overwhelmingly on conscripts. The Russians took an egregious number of casualties in this war, particularly because they fumbled the opening months of the conflict so badly.
mm.
And so I think in December of 22, they first announced that they were going to try to do a drive of 300,000 new conscripts into the force.
Yeah, and there's like 500,000 in country right now in Ukraine, is there not?
Yeah,
Something like that?
they've had a couple of wildly successful drives to grab men that are of military fighting age and throw them into the ranks. And a
Hmm.
lot of them don't want to be there, but that's not up to them.
Yeah, right.
Um,
Yeah.
the and so the contract soldiers, there's probably still a few of them signing contracts, but that's less of an issue in the moment. Wagner is being used to bring out a lot of the prison populations. They've emptied the Russian prisons. Wagner, at its peak, was fielding something around 30,000 soldiers and a number of light infantry battalions that I think we can loosely, I think that's the best term for them is light infantry battalions. But they call them assault detachments. But anyway, Wagner, was a good tool to basically say, hey, look, we will if you sign a contract with Wagner and come serve Mother Russia for a term of 6 months on the combat line, we'll commute your sentence, and it doesn't matter, what they did for the most part.
Mm,
There's a lot of people that have taken them up on that. The Gulag's not a great place to be.
mm,
So
mm,
but then again, Wagner is also, they're the ones doing a lot of these suicide charges straight into machine gun fire.
mm, right. Um, uh, uh, Related topic. So who are some of the uh, key luminaries or thinkers in today's Russia hybrid war engagement strategy? Like for example, a lot of people are familiar with, at least by name, Valery Gerasimov. Is he a prominent figure in this space, or is he less important in this context?
He's really less important for the listeners. Valery Gerasimov is the chief of the Russian general staff. The practice of hybrid warfare, and really, it's particularly as let's call it it's a methodology of conducting limited military interventions in Russia's near abroad. That precedes Gerasimov by hundreds and hundreds of years. The Russians have been doing this forever. But even in the modern context, in the Russo-Georgian War, I would argue is the first real hybrid war of the 21st century. That's actually the first case study I go into in my book. Valery Gerasimov wasn't chief of the general staff then. The reason most people associate him with it is because he published an article in the Military Industrial Courier, simply arguing that the nature of war is changing. And he says, fairly straightforward, that simply the sum military and economic power of of two countries going to war is no longer determinant over who's going to win. There's different things that are coming into play now in terms of sentiment and information, and the protest potential of the public, um, that are more determinant on the outcome than the asymmetry between their militaries and economies. And he was absolutely right. But this is not a grand departure from traditional Russian strategic thinking. He's a general, and he was being, vetted as becoming, one of the top commanders in Russia. And he's expected to have an opinion on these things. He's expected to, opine at a certain academic level, and that's what he was doing.
Do does Russia's infamous like troll and bot farms and news outlets like RT, do they play a role in like a kind of a combined arms effect with their hybrid warfare, like whole of government integration efforts?
Yes, they do. So in Russia today, that's that is how Russia gets its messaging out to its own public, let's say. But then the bot farms. There's not a lot in the West that really consume a whole lot of Russia today. I guess there are some people, and we have access to it. If you're interested in knowing how the Russians talk about these things, you might tune into Russia today. But for the most part, no one in the West is interested. The bot farms are actually run by the GRU. The GRU is Russia's military intelligence service, and they're probably not the only ones, but they're doing it at scale more so than the others. And those bot farms are very real. They can turn the temperature up. They can turn the temperature up, in Western politics. Let's say it's not really clear how much they actually move the needle for one side or the other, but they do turn the temperature up. But you also have to consider who's actually consuming that material. Who actually tunes into things that are developed at a Russian bot farm. They've also been used to make sure that maybe like a Black Lives Matter rally and a All Lives Matter rally in the United States maybe accidentally get scheduled on the same day in the same town square at the same time.
Right, because there are Russian operatives that are the what's the right word? Like in Facebook, they're like the community manager or the page manager or you get what I'm saying? They're the owner of creating these events, and they can create events like you're just describing that can on purpose bring together two different groups of people that oil and water.
Yeah, they can do that. They're sneaky about how they get around protocols,
Yeah,
but they are very active.
right.
Now, the what becomes really interesting is the Russians have used Ukraine as a cyber test bed for years, particularly after the gloves came off following the Crimean annexation. And so all of these Western private cybersecurity companies, have been doing, work in Ukraine, some paid for by the Ukrainian government or by, whatever entities you will, but some of it pro bono, because it's an opportunity for them to get a very good look at some of the best cyber attacks in the business. And Ukraine has gotten shockingly good at recovering from cyber attacks. When they get their servers compromised, they can stand everything up again within 24 hours sometimes, and it's surprising how quick they are to move to react to some of this stuff.
Right. Um, uh, is there evidence that other countries or non-state actors are taking a page from the Russian playbook? And also, like, China. So China famously, they have what's been called the three warfares: public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. Uh, could could you fit that into a hybrid warfare label? And also, what I asked previously: are there any other countries that are deploying these tactics or a version of these tactics?
So yeah, I think you could call the Chinese actions in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, or maybe what they're doing in Philippine coastal waters, as gray zone. And certainly, if let's say some leader in the Philippines or Vietnam were to fire on a Chinese commercial fishing vessel that was pulling out all of the, let's say, the fish stock from their local waters, the Chinese would react in a very muscular way, and that's part of the issue here. They're daring anybody to stare them down.
Hmm. Yeah.
Alternatively, actually, I think that well, let me to finish with China. It does not really contain it contains a deception component, but it does not really contain an activity component or let's say a rapid maneuver component.
Mm.
Um, the other country I think to really watch for in the Russian methodology would be Iran.
Mm.
And Iran has made peace, for many years with using, Shia insurgencies and Shia militias, as a tool for foreign policy. And that effectively is Hezbollah. That's their sponsorship of the Houthis. That's their sponsorship of Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces. Um, and the and the let's say Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas fall into that strategy. They're not Shiite, they're Sunni. So the Iranians, to the Iranians, they're seen as apostates. But apostates can be cannon fodder, and they have no problem with them picking a fight with Israel using Iranian supplies. But the Iranians do a lot of this work with these insurgencies through the Quds Force, and the Quds Force is kind of a combination between, let's say the CIA and U.S. SOCOM, and it's got an intelligence wing, and it's got a special operations wing, and a finance wing, and it's a very sophisticated organization, and it holds some of the most talented individuals from the IRGC. Um, the Quds Force has the ability to conduct a Russian-style hybrid war, and if it were on Iranian borders, um, the open question is: could they, let's say, would it be the Artesh, the Iranian army, or the IRGC? Who is it that would actually, rapidly maneuver to entrench those gains? That's an open question. So if the Iranians were going to do such a campaign, I think it would the most likely candidate would be in Iraq. Right now, it would be in a Shiite-dominated enclave of Iraq, but they would have to have a fairly good reason to do it. And if they didn't pull it off right, and their capacity to interfere with global messaging pales in comparison to the Russians, they would have to there would have to be an emerging crisis that would cost them their current strategic position in order for them to decide to take that risk.
All right. The new book by Curtis Fox is Hybrid Warfare: The Russian Approach to Strategic Competition and Conventional Military Conflict. Well, Curtis, you are right in the bullseye of some of the very most important dynamics that are happening or that are unfolding around us right now. So thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for writing this book and making it available. And with that, Curtis Fox, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thank you very much, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.